Hello, college football fans, and welcome to episode 72 of College Football Throwdown. I'm your co-host, Alex Schmitz, and today I'm joined by my dad, Peter Schmitz, in person.
Hello, Husker fans and college football fans.
And we are joined once again by a very special guest and friend of the podcast, Peter's brother over here, AJ.
Go Big Red!
Go Big Red! All right, so we are here in AJ's RV here in sunny Los Angeles, California. And we are here talking on New Year's Day. Most of the football games, the bowl games of the day have completed, but we're actually sitting in halftime of the Georgia-Texas game currently. Turned out to be not quite the blowout that some people were expecting. Texas is actually winning right now. So we're not going to talk about that game, though, but we will talk about the others that have happened, because all the other bowl games have happened. The semifinal games, the results of the playoff, discussing the national championship, some playoff discussion, all sorts of good stuff. But before we dive into that, I believe you're going to pop our peripheral beverage there.
I will, yes. And today's beverage is a Stella Artois, a wonderful Belgian brewing experience, and one of my favorite beers. And so it's very nice of my good friend and partner Kim, my wife, who bought this and provided this for me to drink during what I refer to as the high holy day of college football, New Year's Day. So it's a nice bottle, as you might know if you know this beer. So there's the thing, and I'll let that drop so you can hear the cap. So there you go. Yeah. Cheers to that. Since we're in person, here you go, Alex. We can cheers to the beer.
Cheers.
And AJ's got himself a fine bourbon to enjoy as well.
There we go. See, so everyone's happy here. We're also going to be talking about a bit of, because there's been the coaching carousel. That always happens every year. Some recent news in terms of that. But before we dive into that, I believe you have some words from our sponsor this week.
I do. We do have a sponsor for our podcast. It is Cruise Planners, your land and cruise experts. If you are interested in doing any kind of travel, not just cruises, but any kind of travel, this is a great place to go. It is family vacations, reunions, group travel is kind of one of their expertise. And you can visit them at www.cruisewithkim.com. It's Cruise Planners, your cruise and land and cruise experts.
All right. If she was here, she would have delivered it better, but that's okay. Not bad for our second attempt.
There you go.
There we go. All right. So like I said, we're going to talk about this coaching carousel thing first off. Most big news one was that Mark Richt was retired, quote-unquote, from his position at Miami. This is coming off of the heels of their game against Wisconsin in the Pinstripe Bowl, where Wisconsin dismantled them 35-3. But I think there was some discord in that community already. What's interesting, though, is that there's the guy who's replacing him, Manny Diaz. He was an assistant there, correct?
Yes.
Left for Temple to be their head coach just a few weeks ago, and now he's coming back to be Miami's head coach, which leads us to believe that this was not something that was planned ahead of time by the athletic director.
If Mark had known that he was planning to retire at the end of this season, and it was kind of already in his plan, it's clearly something that he was just talking about with his family in the recent days, or more likely, in my opinion, there may have been some conversation between him and his athletic director that led him to believe that his vision for the future of the program and the athletic directors maybe were not quite in full alignment, and rather than conceding those differences, he decided it would just be easier to step away and retire.
Yep, that's how it seems. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out at Miami. Obviously, that might be a rebuilding year, but they have a ton of talent.
They do.
The fact that talent didn't show up in that Wisconsin game probably got some fans and people miffed there at that university.
Right. Yep.
And then the other big one is that the coach of Houston, Major Applewhite, was fired, and West Virginia's Daniel
Dana
Dana
Holgerson.
Dana Holgerson is coming in to fill his place, which is interesting because West Virginia was in competition for the Big 12 title this year.
Right.
Now they lost in some of the big games. They did lose, but they played them close. I remember.
Yep.
Like
barely Texas. They barely beat Texas. Barely lost to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so it does seem a little bit of a strange move for him to go from this Big 12 program.
Well, from what I can gather, there were already clearly some disagreements among the between the athletic administration and Dana on what was going on in the program and where they wanted to go and how they wanted to do it and how much money the assistants were getting. All those kinds of issues, but behind the scenes, those guys were not in sync, and as a result, Dana must, based on what his decision was, must have been running away from West Virginia. He is taking a more challenging job, a job that certainly will allow him to recruit because he's going to be in the state of Texas, but he's no longer going to be in a Power 5 conference school, and ultimately, I don't know that it's going to provide a lot more money for he and his assistants long term. But clearly, his time at West Virginia was tenuous, and so he decided it was best to go get a new start.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on these coaching changes, AJ?
No, I don't. I know none of these guys that
Right.
you're talking about.
Yeah, I can't say I'm an expert myself, but I have been seeing some of the articles that have been coming out about it. Also of note is that Manny Diaz, as soon as he got in, apparently he fired all of the offensive coaches, offensive assistants that were there under Mark Richt. So he's cleaning house a bit, bringing in his guys, I'm sure.
Right.
That lends it to Pete's point about, this might have been a last minute thing
Right, and then
where he just walked out the door because he was being forced to change his offensive
Staff.
and
yeah, no, it definitely, they say retired, but it definitely doesn't feel like a graceful retirement.
No, that's right.
For Mark.
Well, and one maybe final comment on the whole coaching carousel. I'm sure there will be more. We're going to hear a lot of those this week, and so on our next podcast we'll be talking about this subject again. There's always implications. There's tumblers that fall, if you will, as a result of that. Who's going to replace Manny at Temple now, and where does that coach come from, and how does that change up and disrupt some staffs? Now, it's not maybe as big of an implication as it would have been in past years because many of these recruits have already signed their national letters of intent, but it will bring up another subject which we'll probably be talking about in a future podcast, which is now that you have this early signing period, what happens to coaches and or what happens to players who sign their letters of intent only to have a coach leave? And is there a difference between a head coach and an assistant coach? There are so many implications to that that it's going to be a big challenge for them.
Yep. Those are things we'll have to wrestle with as we implement these new rules, which, as we discussed on our recruiting podcast, we in general think that the early signing day has been a good thing for college football. But this is one complication that does spring up from it. Okay, so now we're going to get into the bowl games. On the past podcast, Dad and I went through some of the major ones and kind of gave general predictions on who we thought was going to win. And then, of course, the semifinal games, which we will discuss. So going through the list real quick. We obviously talked about Miami, Wisconsin already, 35-3. We both picked Wisconsin to win that, so I think we made out pretty good there. Purdue Auburn, the Music City Bowl. We both picked Auburn, and they end up killing them 63-14. Kind of predicted that Auburn would win, but just the dominance was maybe not expected from me.
Well, yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, I kind of was concerned that might be the case, not the 63, but that it might be a pretty lopsided score. People had just, I think, underplayed the significant loss of the quarterback at UCF and what he meant to that team.
UCF, we're talking about Purdue and Auburn.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about the other game. Apologize.
We're getting there. Don't you worry. Then we got the Alamo Bowl with Washington State, Iowa State. We watched that one pretty closely at our beach house that we were staying at earlier in this holiday break.
Right.
And ended up being close, 28-26. Iowa State was coming back, and there were some really bad refereeing calls, in our opinion, that held Iowa State back. So bummer for them. I know their fans were very passionate and came out in droves for that.
Was that the one? They were Big Ten refs, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to plant that seed for the listeners. Okay.
Just a little thing. All right, and here's one where we deviated on because we both picked Washington State for that one. Florida, Michigan. I picked Florida, and you picked Michigan. And it ended up being a Florida victory 41-15.
Yes.
Another example of an embarrassing bowl loss for Jim Harbaugh at Michigan.
Right. Well, and equally significant is just the implications of that game. The players from Michigan who chose not to play, which changed the dynamic of their defense quite significantly, and their offense for that matter. And then Florida being a team that really was emerging as the season progressed, and Michigan coming off of a most disappointing loss to Ohio State in their final game, and they played like a team that didn't want to be there.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't this the year that Michigan was supposed to be number one?
I don't know about number
AJ,
one.
You're right.
But that's, as you said with Mr. Clower, Brian Clower, who's been on the podcast in the past, Michigan fan, this was supposed to be the year that Jim Harbaugh, like, he had his quarterback, he had his systems in place, he had his talent in place. It didn't quite come through, but now, of course, they're saying next year has an easier schedule, so next year is going to be the year. Because even though it ended disappointingly for them, obviously, with the loss to Ohio State and then this loss, they still had a 10-win season.
Exactly.
You know, that's a step of improvement for them. So I think Michigan fans...
And they have a lot of talent returning. It was just that this was going to be their kind of peak year from a defensive talent standpoint, at least for the next couple of years, because they're going to lose quite a bit to the NFL. In all likelihood, but they have an awful lot of talent returning both sides of the ball, and they may very well be extremely good. And like you said, their schedule next year is going to be more friendly in terms of home versus away.
That's true. All right, then we have the Oklahoma State, Mississippi State played each other, or I'm sorry, it wasn't Mississippi State because they played against Iowa.
Right.
Who did they play? Missouri. That's who they played.
Yeah.
Oklahoma State, Missouri, and Oklahoma State won 38-33. That was a back-and-forth game. Missouri was up, and Oklahoma State was up. We were kind of watching that one in the background yesterday.
Yep.
And then we have Michigan State, Utah, which I predicted Michigan State victory. You predicted Oregon. Ended up being an Oregon victory, but it was only 7-6.
Right.
Not the most exciting game in the world. You know, we saw parts of that game, and Michigan State had a chance there near the end, but they made some dumb time decisions, and
Michigan State needs a new offensive coordinator.
Yeah,
that's the bottom line. They need to change up something offensively, because it's sad to watch that great defense get wasted every year on a team that has no offense.
Right.
That's an absolute fact right there.
Yeah, it is.
I'm telling you, because they do play great defense at that school.
I know.
And that was just pathetic on their offensive staff.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
It was just crazy.
Well, and that's what I remember saying about our game against them. Like, everyone's going to be excited when Nebraska's explosive offense and Michigan State's explosive defense is out there fighting against each other. And then when Nebraska's okay defense and Michigan State's bad offense is out there, everyone's just going to fall asleep.
Not me. I loved it.
Yeah, AJ's all about the defense. We've been talking about that this weekend. Then we have the Holiday Bowl, Northwestern versus Utah, which I did not get the chance to watch yesterday, but I saw the score update afterwards. Utah was winning 20-3 at halftime, but then they gave up 28 points and 5 turnovers in the third quarter. Yeah. So Northwestern ended up winning 31-20.
Right, and we watched that game the entire first half, and Utah was in control. There was clearly kind of an athletic differential that you would have said you were observing between the two schools, and then the second half started, and Utah lost their composure, had a couple of turnovers that were very costly, and then when they still were very much in the ball game, their quarterback, I think AJ, you made this observation, their quarterback just lost his confidence, lost his composure, and he couldn't do any basic thing. Yeah. And he had played reasonably well in the first half, and then without him being on in the second half, their offense just went away.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, that just goes to show how important the quarterback position is in modern day football. If he's not clicking, your offense isn't clicking usually.
Exactly.
That's one where I predicted Northwestern while you predicted Utah, so I get a point there.
You do.
Hooray. That's right. Then we got the Gator Bowl, Texas A&M, NC State. We both predicted Texas A&M, and they ended up winning 52-13. So another blowout victory. Then Mississippi State, who I mentioned earlier, played Iowa in the Outback Bowl. We both predicted Mississippi State, but Iowa ended up coming back and winning it 22-27.
Right.
So there's a win for the Big Ten that we weren't necessarily expecting.
Right.
So that's good to see for Iowa. And then this was a big game we were interested in that just happened today. LSU UCF. I went with my heart and picked UCF while you picked LSU, and LSU ended up winning 40-32. Though that score doesn't really show how dominant LSU was for a majority of the game. But then UCF brought it back near the end and made it close. If they nearly got the onside kick at the end too, which really would have made things interesting in an 8-point game. But they couldn't quite pull it through. Obviously, having Milton out hurt them. Their quarterback, who has replaced him, made some dumb decisions, and their receivers dropped some passes that were just inexcusable.
Unbelievable. How many passes? Number 13 dropped in that game.
Yeah, so that was a little upsetting to watch. LSU's just overall better physical play kind of won the day there.
Right.
Then we have Kentucky Penn State, which we did not see much of. That was the Citrus Bowl. We both predicted a Penn State victory, but then Kentucky ended up winning 27-24. Penn State also was down significantly in the fourth quarter.
Well, it was like 27-7 or 27-14.
I think it might have been 27-3 even.
3.
And then their quarterback, who had an injured foot, put on a spectacular effort in the fourth quarter. Had some touchdowns for them. But they also couldn't pull it through at the end. Made some dumb decisions there near the end that we saw. And then lastly, the game we just finished watching a few hours ago, the Rose Bowl. The Pac-12 champion and the Big Ten champion playing Ohio State, Washington. We both predicted Ohio State, and they ended up winning 28-23. Once again, as Ohio State does, they show their physical dominance. They get a lead early, and then they kind of go into sleepwalk mode, and they nearly let Washington come back near the end of the game.
Right, exactly. And that's the thing, is that Washington kept playing hard, especially in that second half. I kept waiting for Washington to try to find ways that they could take advantage of the speed that they had in certain positions, but they just weren't able to do it until that second half. And then all of a sudden they started finding ways to get that ball into space with some of their speed guys. And Ohio State, like they often do, tended to fall asleep a little bit and started going through the motions. They lost their intensity just a little bit. Weren't as aggressive. All of a sudden the blitzes weren't coming quite as quickly, and all of a sudden Washington was back in it.
Yep. And Washington, once again, they also had some dropped passes that were really rough
Painful.
to see.
Yeah.
But then, I think like one of those guys who made one of those terrible drops, then he made a freaking amazing catch with one hand as he's getting tackled. So, that's how it goes sometimes, I guess, in college football. And then, of course, we have the big ones, the semifinal games and the playoff, which we gave scores to. Let's start with the Notre Dame-Clemson game. I predicted a Notre Dame victory of 35-32 over Clemson, while you predicted Notre Dame victory of 28-24 over Clemson.
Well, you guys were really, really wrong on that. Holy cow, they got spanked.
Well, again, I think that was us voting with our hearts more than our brains a little bit.
That's true.
Because
we wanted somebody else other than Alabama and Clemson to make it in.
Exactly. And comparative scores. I mean, you start looking at the fact that, their one comparable score was they both played Syracuse, for example, who was a very good team this year, or at least a good team this year, and Clemson nearly got beat by them, and Notre Dame pretty much handled them without a problem. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like there was at least a chance that Notre Dame would be able to match up, but once the game started, it was pretty clear there was an athletic differential there, and Clemson had a whole different level of focus than obviously
you'll recall, though, that there was that fumble that didn't seem like it was out of bounds, but then upon review was determined to be out of bounds by the refs,
Yeah.
even though it was very, very close on the edge.
Right. I think
What
it
quarter
was
was that? Was that in
That
the
was
first
early.
quarter?
Yeah.
That was early.
That
Yeah,
was in
see,
the first quarter.
that was at a point where Notre Dame could have capitalized on that, scored a touchdown, and had some momentum.
Right.
But didn't end up going their way. Clemson ended up winning 30-3. Kind of embarrassment for Notre Dame, honestly. Kind of making people question if they should have been considered, even though obviously they were 13-0.
Yeah.
Going by resume, they deserve to be
12-0,
in.
yeah.
12-0. You're right. They deserve to be in there. But they just looked outclassed by Clemson physically and
speed, athleticism,
and then I remember though their defense did get some good stops. They were playing decently well considering Clemson's talent, but their offense just couldn't get anything going.
right.
Yeah.
And Clemson's got some wide receivers that are pretty special.
So our hopes of somebody who hasn't been in the playoff before advancing did not come to pass, unfortunately. And then we have the Alabama-Oklahoma game. Which both of us predicted Alabama victories. I said 42-32. You said 42-24. And it being 45-34. So I guess I was a little closer in terms of the point spread.
Yeah.
But once again, that's not totally reflective of how the game was.
Exactly.
Considering that Alabama went to a 28-0 lead early into the second quarter.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing is Alabama kind of went into almost a cruise mode where it was now the focus was to just kind of get through the rest of the game. Yeah. And then when Oklahoma started having some success, Alabama hunkered down, got physical, and went and scored a couple more touchdowns, or at least I guess maybe one more touchdown, reestablished enough of a lead, and then closed it out.
Yeah, there was a point there in the third quarter where I think Oklahoma had scored like 10 points unanswered, had held Alabama a couple times, and I felt like they had momentum, and then there was some sort of bad play that happened in there, and then the momentum kind of turned back to Alabama, and it didn't quite go away. Right. Even though, Oklahoma, to their credit, they fought hard. They got it within 10 points.
I mean, how many times have you seen a championship game where one team gets out to a 28-point lead and the other team actually holds it together mentally and fights to the end?
Right.
And so you got to give Oklahoma credit for the fact that they didn't give up.
Right, and I know we were talking a lot about their quarterback who won the Heisman Trophy this year. AJ couldn't believe that when he was looking at the video because this dude is like not having his proper form. He's just using all of his arm strength to get the ball there. Yet, despite some questionable decisions by him and some bad throws, he ended up having like 400 yards of offense in the game.
Right.
And, helped them out. Nearly brought it back for them.
Right, so, exactly.
I don't know. That it just seemed nuts. It's today's college football when a guy that was really playing poorly still ends up with 400 yards of offense. It just didn't compute for me.
Yep. Funny how that works.
It's just the measurement is different now, because of how the rules change and stuff like that. It's just much more of a pinball kind of offensive-minded sport, and so these guys can make a lot of poor decisions because they have so many more decisions, and you just have to have a short memory. And so those guys that are great in that role are people that have the ability to ignore. Let's use an example from just this the first half of this game we're watching right now, where a punter makes one mistake, which leads to another mistake, before he can gather himself. Now, a quarterback needs to be able to just almost threw a pick, or maybe he did throw a pick. He needs to be able to forget that, have no memory, and go out there and throw like a madman the next time.
I'd like to know how many offensive plays Oklahoma had in that game. Also, that is a big factor in this.
Yeah.
If they've got 80 plays total on offense, that lends itself to 400 yards. Whereas, if they have the normal 65 to 75 plays, then I don't think he'd have been having 400 yards. It was very, very odd that this kid was just kind of running around throwing the ball up, and I didn't ever get a feel that he was a quarterback. I think he was more or less a running back playing quarterback. He was.
Well, could have a really good arm.
Yeah, well, but he missed an awful lot of balls too. I mean, he was
Right.
throwing balls all
That's
over
true.
the
His
place.
percentage, accuracy percentage wasn't
his
great.
percentage couldn't have not been all that great. But if you pass the ball 50 times, you're going to get
Right. Which
pretty
is why
good yardage.
Which is why you see these quarterbacks with all these crazy stats nowadays,
Yeah.
because most teams are throwing it, 60, 70, 80% of the time or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I don't know what they were, but it sure seemed like that's what it was that he was throwing the ball an awful lot. And when you throw the ball, 50 times in a game, in today's game where they allow for, that the offensive receivers can pretty much do what they want, I'm thinking that 400 yards is not a big game, even against a good defense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how the game has changed, for better or for worse. And that is, of course, referring to this Georgia Texas game, which is going on behind us right now, where the Georgia punter grabbed a low snap and kicked it off and actually had a great punt, but upon review, his knee was down, and then on his next punt, he muffed it badly. That it definitely got to him. You could see him on the sidelines cursing and the like. So quarterbacks need to have that short memory, like you said. All right. So once again, we have Alabama national championship game, the third time in 4 years, I'm pretty sure. I'm disappointed that it turned out that way, just because I would have liked something different to kind of spice up the championship game a little bit more. But at the same time, the two games that we have gotten with them were both fantastic games that went down to the wire, back and forth. Exciting games where coaches were throwing everything they had at the game. So I hope we get something like that. Last year, Dad and I went in person to the semifinal game where they played last year, and Alabama defense just shut down Clemson's offense. They couldn't get anything going. We think Clemson has a better offense this year, so I don't think that will happen again. But I would definitely, if I'm doing a score here, I'm leaning towards Alabama if I'm predicting who's going to win the national championship this year. What would you say, Dad?
I would say that's probably true. It's probably going to be Alabama. Probably going to be Alabama again, regretfully. I'm not happy about that, but I will say that Clemson showed me some individual skill talent that could make it interesting. But I look at what Alabama's offensive line and defensive line are going to be able to do, and I'm just not sure Clemson's going to be up to the task. Although Clemson's quarterback is better than the one that Alabama took advantage of last year. And so I think that might lend itself to a little closer, more competitive game. At least that's what I'm hoping, so that it's at least entertaining for those of us who are sick and tired of the Alabama versus Clemson.
What's that kid's name? Do we know I can't remember what that kid's name at Clemson is. He's a freshman. Holy cow. Really impressive in that bowl game. I mean, he made
You're talking about the quarterback from Clemson?
Clemson, yeah. He made he made Michigan look pathetic.
Well, they were playing against Notre Dame, remember?
Oh, Notre Dame?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
The other team you hate.
The other team.
Yeah.
He made him look. He made him look bad. He made him look real bad.
The Florida quarterback is the one you're thinking of against Michigan.
Oh yeah. That's right.
Trevor Lawrence is Clemson.
Trevor Lawrence at Clemson.
Yeah.
Oh man, he made Notre Dame look just unbelievably. They didn't deserve to be there when you look at that. I mean, there was other teams that were pretty doggone good teams too that could have squeezed into there, but they have shown today in the New Year's Day bowls that they may not have been any better. But still, I'm going to go opposite of what these two just did. They are picking Alabama. I'm picking Clemson. I'm going to pick that young man to win that game.
All right.
All right. I like that. On the other hand, based off what we were just saying, it's true that Clemson's offense is better than it was last year, but you could probably say the same about Alabama's as well.
Exactly.
Because they have Tua in there, could throw it better than Jalen Hurts could. So their offense is more dynamic in that way. So I'm going to predict an Alabama victory, but I do think it'll be close. I'm hoping it's going to be another back and forth good game that I'll at least be able to enjoy as a football fan, even if Alabama crushes my soul again at the end. Because I'll be rooting for Clemson.
Yep.
There's no doubt about that.
That's right.
So I'm going to predict, let's say, 42 Bama, 38 Clemson. That's what I'm going to say. What's your score, Dad?
I'm going to say it's going to be lower scoring than that. So I'm going to go 35 for Bama and 28 Clemson.
28 Clemson. All right. And AJ, what's your score?
35-31 Clemson.
All right. There we go. So we'll see how that turns out. And as per usual, after these semifinal games, we usually get articles and discussions going on about the playoff, how it's working, how well it's not working, who should have been in, et cetera, et cetera. And that always kind of comes out about this time. And there have been some interesting articles because obviously there are a significant portion of college football fans who are sick of seeing the same teams playing each year. And on the one, I saw somebody comparing it to the NBA, because in the NBA the finals have been the same year after year for quite some time. But the difference is there in professional sports you have stars that are planted at those teams that you can see and watch their kind of storylines develop, and those personalities, that they really get attached to. You can see those celebrities and players clash, whereas in college there's a constant churn of the player base.
Right.
So it's not the same in that regard in terms of like looking forward to perennial powers constantly clashing for the top spot.
Right.
And like I said, to their credit, the national championship games we've gotten from them have been great, just in terms of watching entertaining football. But I think that if this continues even further long term, it's going to make the sport even more regional, as we've discussed before, and make it even harder for these other teams who don't have the same access to talent, or aren't willing to kind of do the more shady things that Alabama does in order to maintain that competitive edge. We're just going to get farther away from them, unfortunately.
Right, exactly. And I would say that that's the negative for the sport of college football. Like you said, when it's entertaining, that's great for that moment, and maybe results in some good television ratings for that game. But in terms of overall interest for the sport, it's much more engaging when there is a large number of teams that genuinely are in the mix. And the longer you have this kind of dominance that you're seeing now from Alabama and to a lesser extent Clemson. And Clemson's a team that, you take a couple of players away from their teams and maybe they're not even in that. You know what I mean? They haven't shown or demonstrated the kind of overwhelming dominance within their conference and things like that. Whereas Alabama, I mean, it is massive news if someone even competes and is close to them in a game, much less beating them. And so it's not ever Alabama getting beat by a superior team. It's Alabama losing because it didn't play its best. You know what I mean? And so until something disrupts the power base that Nick Saban has been able to build at Alabama, I'm afraid that's going to perpetuate for a while. You'd like to think that maybe this will lead to discussions about expanding the playoff and things like that, so we can get a few more teams into the mix to create that greater national interest. Otherwise, I think the sport risks the fact that it'll just become ho-hum, another Southeastern Conference bully, whether it's Alabama or Southeastern United States, Clemson, that is winning again because they have closest proximity to the athletes who play the sport the best.
Uh-huh. And this also got me thinking about the 18 playoff, which is something we've been talking about a bit on the podcast here recently. And I think there definitely is traction for it growing amongst college football fans and commissioners and important people of the like. There have been statements from them where they've said that they're open to having discussions and that there definitely is talk going on about expanding the playoff, but also mentioning that it's unlikely that there will be serious movement on that ground for multiple reasons, including TV money and having to get the presidents and chancellors of the universities involved, and how difficult it was to reach the compromise that we got to get the playoff in the first place, to try to implement that before it expires, which I believe doesn't expire until 2024.
And genuinely, you have 2/5 of the Power 5 conferences that are very content and happy with the current arrangement, right? Because they have been able to secure their place in it every time. And so the ACC and the SEC are both most likely, regardless of what they say publicly, they're not at all interested in moving in the direction of 8 until they are forced to by either their television partners or the other conferences are able to build a large enough coalition of movement to force them to do it.
Yep. But one interesting thing about this is it brings up interesting questions about what do we as college football fans want out of the playoff. Obviously, one of the main reasons we wanted to get away from the BCS system was because it was all kind of decided by these poll rankings, combining together who's number one, who's number two, and have them play against each other, even though there were years where you could argue that the number 3 team or number 4 team was actually more talented and would have won,
or at least competed more effectively than the one that did end up playing. Yeah.
Right. So this current system is theoretically allows for that greater competition and for a greater determination of who is actually the best, because now you have the top 4 teams playing against each other in this tournament to see who's going to win.
And also the other big change was that you now had a group of humans that were going to make the choice rather than a computer or even a group of computer polls that were somehow used formulaically to come up with the number.
Right. Well, which the old BCS was determined by the coaches poll, AP poll, and then various computer polls combined together to determine all that. Whereas this, we're accountable to a group of 12 people or however many it is that are in that playoff committee. But it also is an interesting question of, in terms of who gets into the playoff, are we trying to get the very best teams, like the most talented teams in college football right now, in there? Is it about which teams have the best resume? Is it about which teams are going to give us the most competitive games and give us interesting games that'll be fun to watch? What is the thing that we want? Because when you look at those semifinal games, we've had 10 of them now over the course of 5 years, and of those 10, only 2 have been genuinely close. There was Ohio State, Alabama at the start in 2014, and then last year Oklahoma versus Georgia when double overtime, big high scoring game. That was exciting.
You mean Alabama, Georgia?
No.
You mean semifinals. Gotcha.
The semifinal, Oklahoma, Georgia, was very exciting last year. All of the others have been pretty one-sided. Some extremely so, such as the case when Alabama was 35-0 over Michigan State, or Clemson killed Ohio State the next year, and then this year
Clemson, Notre Dame.
Right now, Clemson, Notre Dame is the addition to that this year. So we right now it is going by resume. That seems to be what they're going with. Notre Dame may not necessarily have been more talented than, say, Georgia. But they had the 13-0 record. Georgia lost their championship game, and they lost against LSU end of the year. Notre Dame thus deserves to be in. I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but when they come to the big game and lay an egg, you start to question that methodology a bit. So, but that kind of makes us confront the question: what is it that we want? Do we want the best teams, most deserving resume, best competitive games, most fun games to watch, which is hard to determine
but that's probably
that's very subjective and could change based on how the teams are playing that day, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's probably the worst criteria to use, but it's also the criteria I care about the most because I genuinely want to see fun games, so I don't like watching these blowout victories. Those are only good for the fans of those teams. So if we were to expand the playoff, then we would be allowing that greater diversity that we've talked about. How we've discussed doing it would be that the 5 conference champions would automatically qualify. So even if there were, better teams than, say, when Michigan State won the Big Ten championship that
Or
year.
if Northwestern had won in the Big Ten championship this year, for example, you would have had a Northwestern team that had lost 5 games, right?
4 games at least.
Was it? Yeah.
Yeah,
over the
something like
course
that.
of the season, would have been representing the Big Ten in that grouping.
Right, and probably gotten destroyed by whoever played against them. But I think that doing it that way allows for every conference to always be in every year, so you don't have this consternation about the Pac-12 being left out for so many of the years of the playoff, and then allowing for the 3 wildcard teams with maybe some sort of provision for the group of 5 to say if you have a team that's ranked in the top 12 or something, then they automatically qualify, to throw a bone to them to keep them invested in the sport and to allow Cinderella stories like UCF, for example, to
At least be a part of the process and maybe make a run.
Right. And in the case of this year, if we go by those criteria, it's pretty easy to figure out what the top 8 would have been for an 8-team playoff. So it would have been the 5 champions, and then it would have been Notre Dame, because they were 13-0, UCF, because they were 12-0, and then, Notre Dame was 12-0 too, both undefeated, and then Georgia would have been the extra addition from the SEC, who was considered by many to be the best. They were ranked 5th in the latest poll, above the Ohio State, even though they were the Big Ten champion. Plus, we would have had the 5 champions. So I went ahead and did a little number crunching and put together where everybody would have ranked and who would have played who.
Well, can I stop you for just 1 second before you go into that? So that is based on the argument that if you went to an 8-team playoff, you would go to this structure where the 5 Power 5 teams, Power 5 conferences would get an automatic for their champion into this playoff.
Correct.
Right? And I'm going to be upfront and tell you that's, if we were going to 8, that's what I would want to see as one of the key cornerstones of the thing, because and that's not necessarily because I believe that would get us the 5 best teams.
Right.
It would not. In fact, I'm willing to admit that it would not. But what I am willing to say is that it would create the most diverse interest among the largest contingencies of invested fans. And from growing the sport standpoint, that, in my opinion, is critical to its long-term success, and was one of the features of the old bowl system. I'm talking pre-BCS, alliance, any of that, bowl alliance, back when it was just bowl games. One of the advantages of that was that you had a lot of people invested. Now we have this circumstance where you're beginning to see some diminished investment. And I'm not talking money, just say, but lots of different stuff. I'm talking about investment, emotionally, energy, passion,
and
all
viewers.
that, and viewers. So I think you have to recognize that this is more than just getting the best 8 teams, because that is such a subjective thing. There's no system that would ever do that. So you're hopeful that if you expand the group to be big enough, that you're going to capture all the quote generically best teams, and you're also going to make sure you honor the power brokers, which are the 5 power conferences that bring in most of the viewers, most of the money, most of the sponsorships, and the reason why the ESPNs of the world want, and the Foxes want to write big checks for their TV rights. They don't really give a damn about writing a big check to the AAC, where UCF comes from. They aren't writing a magnitude check to Houston, University of Houston, or Boise State's conference. I can't even remember the name of it right now. But you understand what I'm saying? So that's the fundamental that needs to be acknowledged. These pie in the sky folks who want the 8 best teams no matter what, forget the conferences and all that. That's ignoring literally 100 years of college football history, which can't be ignored.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So that I just want to make that point.
Yep. No, I think that's a valid point to make. And like we said, that would be kind of rewarding resume, kind of saying that your conference is this mini playoff, and if you manage to win that, then you qualify automatically. Yes. Now, one consequence that would come of that is it wouldn't reward scheduling tougher non-conference opponents, because non-conference doesn't really matter. As long as you win your conference, then you're in.
It would matter if you were one of the on the years where you would be potentially one of the at-larges in an 8-team structure. You have those 3 at-larges, and in years where Notre Dame, let's say, has a loss or 2, and there isn't a UCF type of Power 5 or Group of 5 team, then all of a sudden there are 3 additional positions available that might be distributed among the quote quote second best teams of some of those Power 5 conferences. And you know, I may be leading up to an argument for a 16-team playoff. I don't know, but my point is, you would have those opportunities. So non-conference schedules should still matter.
Right. They would still matter, because it would also, you know, seeding would probably be decided by overall strength of schedule and all that stuff. So it would still matter, but at the core, every team would be gunning for, I'm going to win my conference this year.
Correct. And they would make decisions that way.
Yes. Go ahead, AJ.
I'm wondering what you guys' thoughts are on if it expands to 16 or even maybe 32, how that affects the regular season then.
Right.
Do you drop off 2 games during the regular season, and then your conference games, instead of being 9, they drop down to 8 or maybe even 7, and having non-conference games 2 or 3, or how that will all work? Because it's I can remember when this whole playoff thing came up, that the people were talking about they were all saying, there was a lot of negative guys out there saying, you know, it's just going to be a matter of time before we go to 8 or 16 or 32.
The slippery slope argument was
exactly.
huge.
And so I want to know what you guys think about that. Because if you make a point for what you both talked about 8, that sounds pretty good. Why not 16, or why not 32?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, if you fight, if you get into the down and dirty argument about you want the best teams in the playoff, then that is such a subjective thing. You end up going down the NCAA basketball path, which is a path that says, okay, we're gonna give all the major conferences automatic bids. We're gonna give a bunch of second-tier conferences automatic bids, which does not include them, but allows them to be a part of the dance. And then we're going to give ourselves enough at-larges that, by and large, we're going to get the best teams easily into the tournament. So the question is, how big would the college playoff need to be to get to that same level, where effectively you had a few throw-ins, like the numbers, 65, 66, 67, 68 in the NCAA basketball tournament now, that are, these additional teams.
Right.
I mean, they're not going to win the championship, but they're being given a chance to get the credibility of that. And so, do we get there?
But my point on this is, what about those teams that you've seen them throughout the bowl games,
right?
Is that they were peaking at the end of the year,
right?
And there's a lot of teams out there that were not very good at the beginning of the year and ended up playing very, very good football at the end of the year, and the opposing coaches are saying, man, that's not somebody I want to be playing at the end of the year. And that's when you get a 10-2 team that is actually a really super great team, but they couldn't make it into that
group
of 8. Mm-hmm. And yet they're probably playing better football at that time of the year than 2 or 3 of the teams that are above them. That's the thing.
And I didn't answer your question about, I believe if you ever went to 16, if they decided to go to 16 or 32, I believe you would have to reduce the regular season. And I would agree that it would probably end up, you'd have to sacrifice non-conference games primarily, and you might sacrifice one conference game.
Yeah.
But there would be a strong lean to eliminate the non-conference games, because the conference games obviously matter more when if you still have a conference structure. You need to play each other so that you can establish who's going to compete for your championship, and also the money. It's all, at the end of the day, all of those schools need to have their 7 home games.
That's very true. And I totally agree. If we were to expand, we would need to, beyond 8, we would need to reduce games from the regular season. I don't think you'd have to do that at 8 because that's only affecting 8 teams, so it's a small enough amount that it would do that. I remember us talking back when the 4-team playoff was introduced that even though 4 might be too small, it's kind of preventing or slowing down the expansion that
was inevitable.
Felt inevitable.
Yeah.
Because if we started with 8, then maybe right now we'd be talking about 16. And to us as college football fans, the regular season is so important. It's something that's rather unique to college football that the regular season matters so much, and every single game is important. And as you get bigger and bigger, that regular season matters less and less. Even in this 8-team playoff scenario, you'd have some like 9-3 teams that would be playing in that playoff. Even though they might have had 3 bad losses or whatever, but they won their conference. We were saying about Northwestern.
Well, look at Northwestern. Northwestern lost their 3 non-conference games, but then they went whatever it was
6-1,
8-1 or 8-1 in the conference, and then lost in the conference championship game. Had they won that conference championship game, they would have been 9-1 in 10. Big Ten conference games and 0-3 in their non-conference.
Right.
But most of those non-conference games were all early in the season, so I don't know. I think it's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and going on to your point from before, yes, in years where it doesn't work out as nicely as it does this year, where we have Notre Dame and UCF who would clearly be included, going just by the rankings from this year. If we took them out, then it'd be Michigan and Florida would be the other teams that would come in just in terms of that last college football ranking.
Right.
But so here's the games that we would have going by what we said earlier: 5 conference champions plus UCF, Notre Dame, and Georgia.
Okay.
We'd have Alabama versus Washington, 1 versus 8 in terms of seeding of the tournament. Clemson versus UCF, Notre Dame versus Ohio State, and Oklahoma versus Georgia. Now, in terms of getting competitive games, obviously, if we're seeing the Alabamas and Clemsons of the world dominating 3 and 4, the 3 and 4 ranked teams, then them playing against 8th ranked Washington or 7th ranked UCF, those probably would also not be competitive games, maybe even more.
But you can go back to the first year of the college football playoff at 4, and Ohio State just barely got into that tournament and was the big underdog to Alabama in that first year, and they won the game.
True. Well, and actually, I believe so far, and this might change this year, but the number 1 seed has never won so
right.
far.
I was going to say, last year Alabama was the 4 seed.
Yep. No, that's very true. I've got some recency bias talking about this current situation.
Yeah. Right.
Just talking about like that disparity we've seen in terms of talent, even though their rankings might seem close.
I would say that the disparity of talent, in a lot of years, isn't as great as it is this year. Meaning that I believe that in a lot of years, the 8th ranked team in the country is practically as good as the 1st or 2nd ranked team in the country. There are a lot of years where that is much more equitable. I would say that this year, and maybe even recently, because of the dominance of Alabama, they have had some teams that, given the amount of talent and the effectiveness of their coaching, they would rise to the top regardless.
Right. Okay, but so those are the games we'd have.
Those would have been some great games.
Yeah, well, right. Well, you can, Alabama versus Washington, Clemson versus UCF, we can, based on how these other teams have played and the other games we've seen.
They would have won those.
Yeah, they would have won those. But Notre Dame, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Georgia, those probably would have been more competitive.
Yeah.
So, and it makes sense that if Alabama is number 1 at the end of the year, they get rewarded by playing the 8th ranked team. That being an easier game, I think people would be more acceptable to deal with if we got those good games amongst like the 3 and 4 seeds.
Agree.
4 and 5 and 3 and 6 playing each other.
And you'd get less of what we saw, which is one of the points you made. Who wants to be there, right? You go back to the Michigan-Florida game. Very clearly, one team wanted to be there. The other team was kind of going through the motions and not not as interested in being there. There were some other bowl games. I would argue, as we were watching in the background, this Texas versus Georgia team. This is a Georgia team that had Alabama on the ropes and clearly has great talent, and they clearly did not come to play tonight.
Right. They're disappointed that they're not in the playoff.
Exactly. And so to eliminate that, you'd have more games where everyone was locked in, loaded, and ready to go because they were still in it, so to speak.
And this might be a topic we'll talk about on a later podcast, but this current rise in players sitting out of bowl games to protect themselves for their NFL careers, that would become less of an issue if you now have 8 of the top teams playing.
Right.
Now those players have a reason to want to keep playing for their national championship, get their ring.
Correct.
So then going off of that, based on who we think would win, I was saying Georgia probably beats Oklahoma, and then Ohio State maybe beats Notre Dame. That's a little bit more up in the air. But let's say that's how it plays out. Then you have Bama playing against Georgia based on seeding, and then Clemson playing against Ohio State this year.
Right.
So Bama v. Georgia, rematch of a close game from the SEC Championship, as it turns out, based on how this works. And then Clemson versus Ohio State. That, in the end, I would predict that we would still end up with the same national championship.
Sure.
This year.
But, this year, Bama and Clemson, I think,
but
even with the
that
18
wouldn't always
playoff,
be the case. It's like anything else.
Right.
Yeah.
But I just laid that out just kind of as like an example of what it would look like this year if that was implemented.
Right.
So we end up with the same national championship, most likely, but we have some good games along the way.
They have to prove it.
And everyone gets a shot. All the conferences get a shot.
Right.
UCF gets their chance to play in the playoff.
Cinderella. Yep.
Right.
That's the big thing, is that everybody gets a shot there. And you end up with the best teams ending up going on. And you get their effort. You get the top effort from every single team that goes in there. They're going to give it their best.
We say they give it their best, but during that Notre Dame game, it didn't look like Notre Dame was giving Clemson their best.
Let's put it this way: they have every motivation to prepare with the idea that they're going to play their very best game. They're certainly not sloughing in that process. Now, in the case of Notre Dame, they maybe got a little shocked by what they experienced there, and then their intensity and focus was lost.
They just suck.
But the point is that you would have all that intensity of preparation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, and there are obviously a lot of downsides of this. We haven't talked about any of those that which we can go into in a greater detail with regard to the athletes having to play more games, the longer preparations. When would you have that first round? How does that influence conference championship games? Do you have them? Don't you have them? What are that increases even more the advantages of 8 conference games versus 9 conference games. All these other factors that are variables where things are not consistent from conference to conference, etc. Become a bigger issue.
True, but compared to right now, where we are having those issues with, like, the SEC, for example, playing 8 conference games instead of 9, and then their teams have to one less difficult game against a conference opponent they have to play. Thus, they have somewhat better records than some of these Big Ten teams, for example, coming out of the season.
Right.
In this case, you would still have those issues in terms of rankings, but the Big Ten champion, even with 9 games, would always be in.
Right, exactly. And then it would be up to the Big Ten to either partner with some of the other conferences to impose their will of getting a consistent 9-game schedule across all Power 5 conferences, or they might concede that, and then the next television contract negotiate with the plan to move back to 8 games.
But if you're only going to be playing in 10 regular season games, conference game, or just regular season games, how are you going to do 9?
You wouldn't. Now you're talking about if you went to 16 or 32, right? Which we're talking about an 8 team in this discussion that we're having now. But yeah, if you, I'm suggesting to you that at worst you would maybe get rid of 1 non-conference game if you went to 8. That they would
get rid of a non-conference game instead of getting rid of a conference game.
Yep. Right. Yep, that's what people would want because, again, from a television contract standpoint, the TV folks and the fans, they want
Conference
games that matter, right? And the non-conference games, by and large, are typically you play one that matters, one that's significant, and then whatever remainder is not.
Right.
And that's what most of the Power Five does.
Yep.
And so I think instead of that being three, also rans, you would get somebody that was a little bit more substantial.
Right. And then one thing that we haven't talked about yet is I've seen some people talking about the potential of an 8-team playoff, but unlike us, they just went down by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8
Exactly.
in terms of the playoff ranking,
Correct.
which does not take into account automatically qualifying conference champions,
right.
which I think would only exacerbate the problems we currently have. So I hope if we do go in that direction in terms of 8-team playoff, we do not go with that format.
I'm not sure we're in the majority in that view. I share that view with you, Alex, but I would say right now that the college football fan base is very split on that, because especially the younger fans. I would say that most people your age, you having grown up in my household and having been somewhat brainwashed maybe by my own view, you have a view that's probably not the view that's most popular among people your age, in your 20s and even up to the 30s. I think most of those people lack the history and experience of having been a part of the bowl championship series era, where there was the old traditional bowl process. And so they look at that and they view that, logically as just being foolish and stupid. And they don't appreciate the history and tradition that captured and what made that unique for college football, made us unique among the various sports.
Yes, and also talking about downsides of this, of course, which we've mentioned before.
Right.
It decreases even further the importance of these playoff games.
Right.
Now the Rose Bowl is going to be playing potentially like the
third
third best
right.
teams from the Pac-12 and the Big Ten rather than second or
right.
first as they'd like. And you also have the issues that in some years it might be very variable who those 3 wildcard teams would be, and the debates about those would get very heated,
right.
and how the playoff committee ranked them, thus causing people to say we need 16 to make that more fair, so my team gets in.
Right.
So there are certainly problems and complications it creates.
Absolutely.
And this 14 playoff hasn't been bad. They're like at the
attendance
beginning,
has been good.
Money.
The television ratings have been off the charts. Everybody has been a winner here, except for the conferences that don't get to participate because their teams didn't perform well enough in the season, record-wise, to impress this human committee. Okay, and that's where the variations then get back into the argument. It goes round and round, back full circle to the 8 versus 9 conference games, the timing of when the non-conference games get played, all of these things that create advantages for one group over another, and the inconsistency of how that plays out is what is at stake here. That's
how many years has this committee had been in effect?
5 years.
5 years.
This is year 5.
Now, over the 5 years, what do you guys think? How have they done
in terms of
picking the top 4 teams?
Right. Well, like that, for example, that year where Michigan State got in instead of Ohio State, I think people look back on that and say, well, Ohio State was the better team.
Right.
Even
but
though
Michigan State was the
champion.
Big Ten champion.
Yeah. Well, then screw Ohio State.
Well, right, but in our 8-team playoff scenario, Michigan State would have been in as the champion,
and maybe Ohio State would have been the at-large.
But they're an 8 seed going against the number 1 seed.
Correct.
Right.
And they have a higher hill to climb.
Right. But they have a chance, like we say, it's about everyone getting a chance, and that, like we say, that might lead to more of these games that aren't necessarily fun to watch. They're kind of blowouts, and so the first round is maybe a bit of a wash, and it's the second round that people then care about, because now we've gone down to 4 teams again, but these are 4 battle-tested teams.
Right.
Other than that one year, can you think of another year that they were off?
There was also a year where Penn State got left out, where people thought they should have been in. Wasn't that true? And Ohio State got in instead?
No. Ohio State got in for the Michigan State year, and then but there was a year when Oklahoma was excluded and Ohio State got in. That was the first year,
I remember that.
But then Ohio State ended up
they were
winning.
both conference champions,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
But
then
Ohio State had a
ended up-
loss, and they got in anyway. And then they ended up winning the thing. So yeah, I mean, so the point is that overall, I think they've done a good job of getting the
top
four
four
teams. The problem is that from again a sustainable model for the sport, when you basically have ignored the Pac-12 and the Big Ten for 2 and in some cases 3 years in a row, then those fan bases begin to lose interest. That they just put it on the shelf. It goes on the back burner.
I understand that, but still, you have a committee that is, as you know, made up of a lot of very good people,
Right.
that know what they're doing,
Right.
and even if a conference gets
Yep.
tossed out, they have picked. Over the 5 years that it's been going on,
Yep.
they've done a pretty doggone good job of picking the
well,
four
like
teams.
we were
Right.
upset last year that Alabama got in at
Right.
4, despite the fact they lost their conference
And they
didn't play, right?
Right. They didn't even play in
Because
the
they
conference.
lost right at the end of
And-
the year. But then Alabama goes on to win the
win
whole
it.
thing.
Yeah.
So
And Ohio State, like he just mentioned a couple of minutes ago,
Right.
Ohio State came in as the
Right.
4th seed and ended up winning the
the
damn
difference
thing.
was last
So-
year Georgia from the SEC was already in as the number 1 seed, so they had 2 SEC teams in there, and then they both ended up playing each other in
The conference.
championship.
national
Or the
championship
national
game,
championship.
and Alabama won.
Wins it again.
Right. So once again, that kind of proves that Alabama was
Deserving.
deserving to be in.
Be in
right.
it,
But that gets back to like the resume versus getting
getting
the best
to get in the
teams.
first place. Yeah.
Right.
There needs to be some credibility to that. And
Do you think there was any other teams that were going to be able to deal with
well,
Georgia and Alabama last year?
Well, Clemson certainly. If you take Alabama out of that mix, then Clemson would have been a team.
but Clemson was in.
No, I know, and I'm saying
Well, that's what
he's saying would they have been a viable competitor on a national championship? Right? That's what you were.
No.
asking.
That what I'm saying is they were in there and they got beat.
Clemson got beat by
right,
Alabama.
right.
Who
So-
who would have gotten in aside from Alabama that would have been like worthy? And I think Ohio State was the other one people were talking about because they were the Big
Right.
Ten champion.
Right, and they had done well, except they had the blowout loss against Iowa, which kept them out at the ultimate end of the discussion. Even though Ohio State was the Big Ten champion,
Right.
they did not.
And like this year, the ugly loss against Purdue kept
Right.
them out
Right.
when compared to Oklahoma.
Right, or
But when it comes down to it,
Notre Dame.
Yeah,
the 5 years,
Yep.
they've done a doggone
Yeah.
good job
No,
of picking out
picking out 4 teams that are probably the best
The
4
best
teams,
4
or
teams.
certainly 4 of the best 5. I mean,
Yeah.
it wasn't like you were arguing about the 8th team or anything like that. It was just
Yeah.
about that small group, and that's true. Except that again, from a playoff and an interest in the sport standpoint, I think I am observing it to be very detrimental to the sport when you have these large contingencies of the fan base
That don't
really
get into it.
that are not even connected, that aren't even
Right.
paying attention.
Because when you look at it, like Clemson, Oklahoma, Ohio State, and Alabama have been in quite a number of them, and then
Right.
you have Michigan State, Washington making it in here and
Yeah.
there,
Oregon,
right? But that kind of dominance by those teams making it in, consistently year in year out, less so for Ohio State, obviously, but I can certainly, if I was a Pac-12 fan, I think I'd feel even more strongly about this.
absolutely.
Do you think that that's going to change when it goes to 8?
Well, if it goes state, everybody will be included.
You assume,
Right, with our 5 championship model.
with our
Yes.
with our model.
With our model, everyone is included, and it might, like I said, it might still be that Alabama would have played Washington this year, and Washington probably would have gotten creamed, and Alabama would have gone on and been in the national championship. But everyone would have had a chance. All the fans, like Dad said, would be interested, and there's the potential for that Cinderella story. We saw Washington today,
almost
buckle
come
down
back.
and almost come back. Yeah,
Right. Now, and here would be my other response is that I don't think you go to 8 teams in the next, when they make this next decision, whether it's prior to the 10-year window that they established for the 4 years or for the 4 team, or whether they wait until that full 10 years is up. Whenever this change happens, if they go to 8, if it does not include a guarantee of those 5 conference, then you shouldn't do it. Then you should stay at 4, because then you're already where you need to be, if that's what it is. Because you're basically saying that keeping the regional all regions interested, so it remains a nationally relevant sport, is not as important to you collectively as just getting the 4 best teams. Mm-hmm. That's the only thing that matters to you, and then you're putting an awful lot of faith in that committee to get it right every time. Now, like you say, you're saying in general, have they done well? Yes. Do I have a lot of specific things I would argue with them about? Absolutely. I think that what they described as the criterion before this thing, when this thing was being established and before it ever even the first year had happened, is very different than what they now are using. Because the heavy emphasis going into that first year was about conference championships and about strength of schedule, which motivated conferences like the Big Ten, Pac-12, etc., to seize on that statements and those emphases and say, we're going to schedule that way. And schedules are made way in advance, as you know, and so we did that. The SEC wisely and the ACC wisely took a wait-and-see approach, decided that they would stay back and go the easier route and just take a look-see and figure out what it was like, knowing that they could always increase they could dump a lesser opponent and add a more challenging opponent if they had wanted to. If the reverse had been true and Alabama had been excluded because their strength of schedule wasn't commensurate, because they didn't play 9 conference games and they played, the Citadel in their non-conference, then maybe Alabama's athletic director would have been feeling slighted, and he would be increasing the challenge of his non-conference schedule, and they'd be rearranging things, or they might be talking as a conference about going to 9 conference games.
Right.
So that's my point.
And we had an example of adaptation where Oklahoma was left out at the start, and then they added their conference championship game as a result of that. And now this year, we had Notre Dame get in without being in a conference because they were undefeated. And now there's been some people criticizing them like, oh, come back when you win a conference championship game. Actually
hurry
join
up and get
one of
in
these.
One.
Which it'll be interesting to see if that actually has an effect on Notre Dame.
No.
Probably not, given their history.
Guarantee you that's not happening.
But I would agree with you in general that
they didn't deserve to be there.
Right. Well, and that's one where I think the committee got it right in terms of resume because they were undefeated.
And they played a 12-game season.
They looked at this same committee looked at that 12-0 UCF team last year and didn't give them a chance.
And this year. True, but you look at Notre Dame's schedule, they beat like Stanford, USC, they beat some good teams,
Syracuse,
above the level of what UCF
some other
was
ACC
playing.
teams, Michigan.
Right.
They had a conference. A full schedule that was as challenging as just about any conference schedule. They had a schedule that was harder than Nebraska's. They had a schedule that was harder than probably anybody in the Big Ten except for Michigan.
Right. And especially when you consider that those schedules are made years in advance. Right. If Stanford was on point this year, that would have been a much harder game. And
USC.
USC if USC wasn't down.
Right.
So they played some traditional powers.
Right. So year in and year out, they're usually going to have a resume, if they go undefeated, that is hard to ignore.
Right.
At 12 games.
Right. But if they have one loss, then they're probably out.
Yeah, right. They're out.
Well, now if you go to 8 teams though, now Notre Dame will be in that discussion for are they 8th, are they 9th, are they 10th, even with one loss, because of the strength of the rest of their schedule.
Well, and also
on a typical year.
Last thing I'll say on this, with my whole us talking about getting the 5 championship teams in, we think that's going to be tricky. Then our little stipulation about like having one group of 5 team in if they're like ranked in the top 12 or whatever, it's probably even harder to get in because then you might get it might not be UCF, it might be Boise State or something else one year where they get in and then they get creamed because they're not as talented as Alabama when they're playing the 1 seed or whatever.
You don't want to make that an automatic. You want to make that's why you make them one of the at-larges. And then allow that committee to make the decision based on body of work.
Not an automatic, but would you agree that it should be like in the rules, like if a group of 5 team is in the top 10, they have to be in?
I would. Because otherwise, Otherwise, it would be very, very difficult for them to be part of the party. And so if you're going to go to 8, you've got to make some of those accommodations so that ultimately you keep interest. Again, I would argue that's a group of 5. That's 5 additional conferences that are all vying for that one spot in most cases. The idea of them getting 2 spots would be highly unlikely, although not impossible.
Yeah, I would agree. And obviously we've seen with UCF
Right.
in
Well,
last year and this year.
There were years when Boise State and Houston were both outstanding in the same year.
No, Boise State back in the late
Right.
late
And
2000s,
what if you had BYU and Notre Dame both undefeated? Because BYU's an independent. You know, so
Yeah.
there are some other teams out there that could make that whole process, and that's why you have the 3 at-larges. But that's that committee's job. So I
Right.
didn't say it was easy.
Well, right. Yep. Well, and like I say, as we talked about every time we talk about expansion, then that makes those 3 wild card spots will be
Very precious.
very heavily contested, and there will be some teams that get left out. And then we'll play great in their bowl game, and everyone will be like, "Well, they should have been in," just like we have now. So that problem won't go away. But the point is, by expanding it and including the 5 conference champions, then all the Power 5 get representation. You have that interest across the map, and you give those teams, even if they're matched up against the Alabamas or Clemsons, they have that opportunity to be the Cinderella story
Right.
that beats the
Unexpected
the Titan,
victory.
and makes
Yeah.
their way to the end.
Absolutely. You think Purdue thought they were going to beat Ohio State before that game? Probably not.
Probably not.
I shouldn't say they didn't. I'm sure they did believe it, but nobody else did.
Right.
So the point is that you still have that opportunity to prove people wrong. UCF did it last year against Auburn in their bowl game. I mean, their teams can rise above.
Yep. And even this year against LSU, they played them close at the end of the day.
Right.
All right, good. So this was a good conversation about the playoff. We'll definitely talk about this more in the future. This is going to be an ongoing discussion, probably not going to be resolved anytime soon.
No.
In our next podcast, if we have the time, we will definitely talk about this players skipping the bowl games that we kind of teased earlier. And that has some interesting things to say about refereeing that we've noticed as watching these bowl games. So we have some interesting topics to discuss, along with obviously the national championship game.
Right.
So there's some good podcasts in store for you listeners. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. You can find us online at footballthrowdown.podomatic.com. You can find us on iTunes or on Apple Podcasts if you search College Football Throwdown. We love reading reviews and comments from the listeners. Getting feedback is always appreciated. So thank you for being with me here today, Dad, and thank you, AJ, for being our guest star on this podcast.
Go Big Red.
That's right. Till next time, go Big Red.
Go Big Red.